Welcome to the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute at New York University. This is a program that is being sponsored by the Literary Reportage concentration at the Institute, and I'm very happy that you're all coming out for tonight. And I'm really happy that Susan Orlean is able to come fly all the way from California to come and talk to us about her new book.
And boy, are my arms tired.
Oh, but
So glad I finally got to use
we
that
need the
joke.
rim shot.
Yeah, I'm waiting for the rim shot.
Yeah. Susan Orlean needs probably no introduction to this, a crowd like this, but she is the author of Saturday Night, Red Sox Bluefish, which actually I recommend you get. It's for early columns, and it's terrific, an undervalued book. The Orchid Thief, 2 collections, and now her masterpiece, Rin Tin Tin. Rin Tin Tin, I'm not a dog pet person, and I really enjoyed the book. Rin Tin Tin, the reason I enjoyed it is that what Susan has done in this book, from my perspective, is she's taken Rin Tin Tin and the phenomenon and all the things around Rin Tin Tin and used him or it as an incredible lens to look at all sorts of things in American culture through, I started making a list, but it got too long, but post-World War I America, the birth of Hollywood, the popularity of pets with the urbanization of America, the advent of TV, the advent of colorization in TV, and really gives you this very interesting lens to look at all these different things, all in the name of exploring this phenomenon of Rin Tin Tin, this incredibly enduring character throughout movies and television. So I heartily recommend the book. When I first met you, which was I think 2004, you had just gotten a contract for this book, and I remember you were in that post-contract phase where you're sort of happy but a little befuddled and a little terrified, and said, I don't really know what I'm going to do with this. I think, and we talked a bit, and I frankly didn't no idea what kind of thing you would do either, but you were just building this house you have in upstate
Right.
New York, and you showed me the plans, and they were gorgeous. And you only owned 1 dog then, I think. You had a dog.
One dog.
One dog.
And no other animals.
Right, now you famously own a dog, 3 cats, 2 fish, 2 ducks, 4 turkeys, 8 chickens, 3 guinea fowl, and 12 Black Angus cattle. So I guess my question is, how did you manage to collect this sort of assortment more suitable for either Noah or Dr. Dolittle, and what made you decide to devote your life to this project, and how did you get so animal crazy?
That's a lot of good questions, and they're not unrelated actually. I've always loved animals, and I've always loved dogs, and I actually got a dog when I was in college, which is one of those signs of immaturity, among other things, and unrealism, and many other, foolish impulses all brought together. So I had a dog when I was a kid, and I was also a big horseback rider. So I've always liked animals. I had just gotten a dog. My dog was a puppy, I think, when we first met, or he was young. I think when you are a writer of nonfiction, you're influenced by what's going on in your life, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. I don't think the best thing is to only write stories that somehow come out of your own life, but I think it's inevitable that your eye begins catching on things that you're already thinking about, or you're suddenly inhabiting worlds that you hadn't been inhabiting previously, and suddenly it makes you think of other stories. So I had just gotten this new puppy, and I actually did a few dog stories from the New Yorker. I profiled a show dog, and then what happens, you do one story and it leads you to another story, so I tend to go on a tear for a while because one story leads to another to another. The story about the show dog somehow brought me to the idea of doing a story about the film and television unit of American Humane, and these are the people that issue the No Animals Were Harmed endorsement on film, and I thought that would be a great story, and it was actually really fun, and a lot of, if you're writing about those people, you have to write about the history of animals in Hollywood and how their treatment has changed, because it certainly has changed. If you write about animals in Hollywood and do any history, you will inevitably come across the name of Rin Tin Tin. It's unavoidable. This would have been a moment of nostalgic reverie and nothing more. I mean, I had this big reaction of, oh my God, Rin Tin Tin, and I was already in the mind of thinking about animals, and it sort of threw me back in my chair as I sat there thinking about my memories of Rin Tin Tin, which had been, you know, I hadn't touched on for many, many, many years. But the inevitable happened, which is I Googled Rin Tin Tin. It seems to be that's the reflex of, you know, absolutely anything you come across, you Google it. And the first thing that came up talked about his being found in World War I, being a silent film star. This was so disconcerting almost, because I thought, wait, hold on a minute, now I'm totally confused. I was having this nostalgic moment of, you know, the 1950s, Rin Tin Tin, my early childhood, and suddenly I'm reading something that made no sense to me in terms of time, or even the logic of him having this career in silent film. So it was really like falling down a rabbit hole, and I decided then and there I was going to do a book about it without having a clue about what that meant.
Right, and that's when I met you.
Exactly. Yeah, I think I was in that state of shock, like, and what did I mean when I said that I was doing this?
And so was Rin Tin Tin the enabler for all the animals that came, including the Angus? Or was it the other way around?
You know, it was a funny thing, because during the time that I had started working, I mean, this book actually spans, someone could do a meta book about what happened in my life during the span of time that I was working on the book, because I had a baby. I then moved from, I had been living in Manhattan, then I moved to Boston because I got married, and then I had a baby, and then we moved to our house upstate. I think we thought it would be fairly temporary. And once we were up there, I had this discovery one day. I was looking around and I thought, wow, I could just kind of get animals. You know, I mean, I had a lot of room, and it just seemed like, you know, and if you drive around upstate for more than 2 minutes, you will see someone with a sign saying, you know, goat for sale, you know, the famous pets or meat.
That's all I could think of, yeah.
And yeah, I know, and it's true. That's really what it is. And then I first got obsessed with getting chickens, which was completely out of left field. I've always been more of a fur person than a feather person, and I didn't, you know, I didn't eat a lot of eggs, but I just suddenly thought, I have to get some chickens. And have any of you seen the movie The Natural History of the Chicken? It's a hilarious documentary, which I recommend. And it's about chicken keeping, both urban chickens, but just in general, the phenomenology of chickens. And I thought, I've got to get some chickens. And then I realized you could order them by mail. And then I thought, okay, I'm definitely getting chickens. And then one day, I got my chickens, and I loved having them. And one day, I went to CVS to get some shampoo, and on the way home, I got some guinea fowl. You know, because I was
who doesn't that happen to?
I took a shortcut, and I passed someone who had a sign up saying guinea fowl for sale. And I thought, guinea fowl, I've heard about those. And I stopped, and I, you know, came home, said to my husband, you know, I'm here, I got the shampoo, I got the guinea fowl, and...
But this is like every parent's worst nightmare, you know?
I know.
Like, you know that the turtle is going to lead to something like this.
But, well, yeah, it's, you know what, my feeling is, dogs are like a gateway animal. And if you're living somewhere where you have a lot of space, it just goes from there. And the cattle my husband got, and again, it was the same thing where one day he said, you know, so tomorrow they're delivering our cattle. And I said, cattle, wow.
I said, happy anniversary,
Yeah.
the cattle will be here soon.
Yeah, well, he actually, I have an IOU for a donkey because that's what he was getting me last year for my birthday. But we haven't sort of actualized that
one
yet.
was something to look forward to, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, your books, you know, from the conversation we had in my book, you talk very articulately about passion, people with a passion that you like to write about and trail behind them and sort of get in their slipstream. And certainly you've written about some fantastic, passionate characters, and you have in this book as well. But also, I'm interested in the effect of the reporting on you. I mean, there's one line you say, towards the end of the book, you say, I myself began to feel like I was getting a little unhinged, launching into arguments whenever anyone made a comment equating Rin Tin Tin with Lassie, or asked me, as they always did, whether there was just one Rin Tin Tin, or, even more simply, why I had spent years writing a book about a dog. I read this with great trepidation, not want to avoid all those questions. How did it affect you? I mean, it sounds like you too got a little bit wacky.
Yes. You know, on one hand, I'm used to this. When I started my career as a writer, I started with a very defined job. My first real job was as a music critic. And I had a very defined set of tasks, and I grew very restless. I love music. I didn't really like writing criticism. So I was offered a job. I was working for an alternative news weekly, and I was offered a job covering the county. And you know what that means. I mean, you go to the tax board meetings and all this stuff. But I very much wanted a job as, not as a critic, but as a writer. So I accepted the job. And the first story I did was I had been out driving around in the county and realized that amyl nitrate was being sold. This was early on, where it was a pretty, at that point, unknown quantity. And it was being sold in all of these little grocery stores, and there was no law about it at all. And I thought, this is a great story. So I wrote it, and I turned it in, and my editor said, you're supposed to be covering the county. And I said, well, it takes place in the county. And he was a little flabbergasted by that description of the story. And soon after that, he just let me go. I mean, let me do what I wanted to do. He didn't let me go. He let me, he basically said that, I am no longer expecting you to cover the county as I had envisioned it.
Right.
Just do what you do. So, to be honest, I think I've always done stories that initially get that reaction of, I don't get it. I mean, a toothless guy who stole orchids that aren't worth all that much, that's a story.
Yeah.
I mean, almost everything that I've spent a lot of time on, and a 10-year-old kid in New Jersey, that's a story. So I'm used to that, and I tend to both, each time I think, I'm not going to do that kind of story anymore. I'm not going to do the story where everybody says, I don't get it, what's it about? And to be honest with you, I thought Rin Tin Tin was not that kind of story. I thought, well, this one's so obvious. I'm not going to have people saying to me, what on earth are you doing? Or I don't get it, what's it about? Because to me it seemed, well, this is a celebrity, essentially. It's
a celebrity profile.
Yeah, it's a known quantity, as opposed to, if you compare it to The Orchid Thief, a guy no one's ever heard of, who's done something that's not a capital crime, You know, it was obscurity piled on obscurity, and this to me seemed so much more, you know, mainstream, but the reaction was exactly the same, which was, I don't get it, what's it about? And any writer who lives with the subject for a long time will find that there's always a pattern of questions, that no matter what, everyone will ask you the same couple of questions, and you start getting, you know, sort of like, I've already answered this a million times. But everybody says, so was there just one Rin Tin Tin? I mean, it's just a natural, as a matter of fact, they ask it so regularly that there was a long time where I thought that would be my lead for the book, that I would begin in some way addressing that question, because it's important. I mean, it actually, of course, if you're talking about a dog who was born in 1918, but we're still talking about him, there's a very obvious question, which is either this dog truly is immortal, or there are multiples.
Right. I mean, you do, it's interesting because you're right, it is a sort of, what could be more obvious in some ways than a book about Rin Tin Tin and a sort of celebrity profile. And then yet you ask some questions, some very sort of penetrating questions about, you know, what was this dog really like? You know, what's it like to write about something or someone who, you know, those kind of questions aren't easily solved? I mean, where do you get to the essence of the only thing you come up with is that he probably wasn't a very nice dog.
Right. Well, and also at some point early on, the idea of this dog became very diffuse because he existed, but he was an actor. I mean, there are a lot of questions about identity in the book because the difference between an actor and the character they play is a fascinating one. In this case, Rin Tin Tin, you know, to make it even more pointed, often his character in movies was called Rin Tin Tin. It would be as if Humphrey Bogart was named Humphrey Bogart in all his movies. I mean, this question of, well then, was he an actor? Was he, were these cameos? What does it mean? Then once we're talking about the next generations and subsequent generations, you know, the idea of the identity becomes more and more scattered. By the time you get to the 1950s, the television show called The Adventures of Rin Tin Tin was set in the 1870s, which was before German Shepherds even existed as a breed. So it's a complete fabrication. And the dog Rin Tin Tin in the TV show was actually played by other dogs. So the identity gets very complex. And I was trying to explain to somebody the only time I encountered a similar challenge as a writer, and this will seem like a very weird analogy to make, but I'd once tried to do a profile of an architectural firm that was a big up-and-coming firm. And there was a point where I thought, what is a firm? I mean, it seems to have an identity, and yet there is no such thing. It's a kind of combination of people. So is it the character of each of the people involved? And yet it seemed to have an identity. It was a very weird thing to grapple with. And that was certainly, I wanted to kind of keep the concrete connection in the book to the idea that this was not a character. This was initially and subsequently, there was always a living dog named Rin Tin Tin who people could see and touch and pet. And it wasn't like Scooby-Doo, you know, it wasn't merely a character, because that wouldn't be an interesting.
I mean, what was so fascinating is that you have this sort of paradox where, as you say, this dog is sort of changing, as one dog would have to be, and you talk about Rin Tin 1, and then Junior, and then 2, and 3, and then the other hand is staying the same, but the people who invest themselves in him, they, you know, it's something actually really poignant about that, you know, about you know, Lee Duncan and Burt, what was the last name?
Leonard.
Burt Leonard, and how they invested themselves and their whole story in him, Duncan for longer than Leonard, but you know, that was sort of the living manifestation of him in some way.
And you know, there's also the fact that the book provided an opportunity to write about our relationship to dogs as a culture, using Rin Tin Tin's changing persona, which tracks very neatly. You know, people in the 1920s who had dogs had a different relationship with them than people in the you know, 1990s. The world has changed, the population has changed, our relationship to animals has changed, and you know, it's dramatic. I mean, there's a huge change in that social arrangement. And using Rin Tin Tin, I don't like writing essays, you know, to say, I'm going to now write an essay about the changing role of dogs in culture. I mean, I would die before I do that. Or, no, I probably wouldn't die, but I wouldn't, it would be, that's not the kind of thing I like writing about. I really prefer looking at something very specific, and through that, realizing that I can, it can be this, you know, very narrow kind of way of peering into a very big space. Rather than just walking into the space and saying, okay, I'm going to describe it to you. So I loved being, and that was something I hadn't anticipated. I mean, when I went into working on the book, since I literally went from Googling Rin Tin Tin to saying, I'm doing a book about this. So, you know, there were a few months of total shock and awe, where I thought, what have I done? And, you know, so that was a discovery where I thought, wow, this is amazing. I mean, in the 1920s, he represented this kind of dog in movies, and he had this kind of relationship with Lee. And then in the 1930s and 1940s, you know, suddenly it was a very different relationship, and people moved from farms into the city, and, you know, the whole kind of secondary story that I tell about the women who introduced the American people to the idea of dog obedience, which was this incredible thing that, you know, in the 1930s, people were moving into cities and they were bringing their dogs with them. Suddenly they're sharing living space with dogs.
They're not out on the farm anymore. I was thinking it's almost like the invention of the idea of the child, you know, the idea of the pet.
Almost exactly the same timing.
You
know, where suddenly you think, whoa, I mean, these were workers on the farm, and maybe they had a little bit of a special relationship with us because of our ranking dogs above most other animals. Suddenly, they're living in your apartment where you moved, you know, you moved to Chicago to get a job in a factory, you bring a dog, and there you are, looking at each other. Like, you know, if you live on a farm, you don't own a leash. You don't walk a dog on a leash. And suddenly you're in the city. And I don't know whether you would say specifically one individual, but say a family moves and the next generation is city dwelling and living with dogs, and suddenly thinking, wow, I mean, it's very different to have a dog living in the house.
And so much of the book, it seemed too, is that it was people using Rin Tin Tin to hang on to some sort of pastoral notion of what America was, especially a Western notion. And everyone has this sort of connection. You did incredible research for this book. You were in Texas a lot, California a lot, France a lot, I guess for the World War I. Was this the first time you'd done that kind of far-ranging archival research?
Yeah, definitely. When I was working on The Orchid Thief, I certainly did a lot of research, but a lot of it was in the here and now. A lot of it was time spent with the people I was writing about. Suddenly I was writing this completely other sort of project where everybody was dead, and I didn't really know how to go about it, and it took me a year or two to begin understanding that libraries, archives, you know, boxes of stuff were going to be vivid enough that I could write about it. But then I did a lot of that. I mean, I went to California a lot because that is where, you know, all of the Hollywood history is located. Lee Duncan's papers are there, Burt Leonard's papers are there, and then I came across the storage unit of his material very much in the 11th hour, and that was all there. But going to France, where Rin Tin Tin was born and where he was buried, I just felt strongly that I had to be there. I was doing a lot of library research, a lot of archive research. It was wonderful, but I really felt strongly that I needed to get out into the world and, you know, just put my hands on some real things, right, and to remind myself of that connection, and also because I was still trying to figure out how I would write it, and I felt that those real-time experiences were going to help me put the book together.
You had, I mean, Lee Duncan, who was the guy who discovered or rescued, I'm not sure what the proper word is, Rin Tin Tin, you really get an incredible psychological profile of this guy, both his rise and his sort of fall. And Susan has this very nice line. She says about her doing the research on him, "This was the first time I'd ever spent so much time learning about one person's life. And it was a new experience for me to fall so deeply into it. And strangest of all, to feel, as I did sometimes, that I knew more about Lee than he might have known about himself, and more that I would have known if I had met him and talked to him and learned about him in the more usual way. I had never realized how crackling and alive someone's papers could be." And there are these wonderful moments where you're finding these things in this literally the storage unit that, I'm sorry, no, with him it's papers in the library, but with the other one is a storage unit. You said this research, some of this stuff came out over the last hour, some discoveries?
Yes, and I will say that was the thing about learning about Lee, was suddenly realizing that I'm so used to reporting that's based on real time spent with people. And I rely a lot on my ability to sort of crack the code of a person, right, and figure them out. And that's one way to know them. Then there's this other way to know them, which really was much more intimate, much more quantity of knowledge than you would ever get from someone directly. And particularly Lee, who I think was probably not very forthcoming. And instead I was reading, you know, I mean, the ultimate was reading condolence letters after he died, right, and material that he would have never shared with me, I'm sure.
He also had an unfinished memoir, right? Or
right.
Autobiography,
So
right?
It was, he had written a memoir, and about probably a third of it still exists and the rest has been lost, which of course is kind of terrible, but that had a kind of eloquence about, especially about his early childhood, where he was left in an orphanage, that I don't think he would have been nearly so eloquent or as forthcoming, right, if I'd spoken to him in person. And I would have never read those notes that were written almost for his own memories. It just completely surprised me. In the case of Burt, it was even more dramatic. I thought I was done with the reporting. And I, at that point, imagined the book would be structured totally differently. It was going to be mostly about Lee and about Daphne Hereford, the woman who breeds the dogs today. Right. And with a little footnote of Burt. And Burt was the man who produced the Rin Tin Tin television show in the 1950s. But I thought, well, he's just a producer. He doesn't, it's not that meaningful. I'll just, you know, deal with him, but that's not a huge part of the book. And I had gotten a certain amount of material about him in the Screen Gems archives and, you know, material in libraries. So I thought, all right, I'm ready to write. I'm ready to go. I'd gone to interview his daughter, and Burt had been alive the first year or two I was working on the book, but number one, I couldn't find him. And number two, it wasn't that big of a priority to me because I didn't think it was that important.
He was essentially homeless by this time, right? He was living on people's
which is
couches.
why I couldn't find him.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't have a phone number. He'd gone from being one of the most successful producers in Hollywood to being homeless. So I couldn't find him, and I would call different people I knew he knew, who would say, you know, I haven't seen Bert in ages, and
he owes me money.
Yes, they all said, you know, if you see him, he owes me $150,000. If you can mention it, and I said, oh yeah, no problem. In fact, I mean, literally all of them, you know, high and low, he owed everybody money. So I then saw his obituary. Through his obituary, I was able to track down one of his daughters, and I went and interviewed her. And she hadn't really grown up with him because he was divorced from her mother. So she knew him, but not so intimately. And we had a nice talk. And I thought, all right, done my due diligence. I've kind of done the Bert thing. I'm done here. And I put away my notebook, getting my coat. And she said, wait, you know, now that I think about it, I think my dad had a storage unit. Do you want to see it? And I had a moment where, you know, that you feel guilty as a reporter because part of you wants to unhear it, like, no, I didn't hear this. And the other part of you is thinking, oh my God. And she said, let me see if I can find the key. So she disappeared for a few minutes and I just sort of sat there thinking, oh my, I could like leave right now and just, I don't have to deal with whatever this is, or maybe it's going to be amazing. She came down, she handed me the key, she said, you know, help yourself. And I wrote about this scene in the book because there were so many instances in this book, in the story, of things came this close to being lost.
All the letters and everything was about to be thrown out, and then the last moment the maid or someone says, no, we should probably keep these, and takes them home.
And you know, the puppy is born on a battlefield, and it was pure serendipity, pure luck that Lee happened upon them. And it just was almost unnerving to me to see how there's so many moments where life, did any of you see the movie Sliding Doors? You know, just that feeling that things are this close to going a totally different way and then realizing life is different. And the different life you have, of course, you never know which one you didn't have. In any case, I did write at some length about that experience of going to the storage unit and opening it without having any idea of what would be there, and it was completely stacked to the ceiling because he was homeless. This was all of his papers, everything that mattered to him, and almost all of them were related in one way or another to Rin Tin Tin. But there were also millions of things that I would, you know, it wasn't a formal archive. It was basically all of his stuff.
Like a scene from Hoarders.
I mean, it was everything. It was his checking account statements and his, it was everything. Everything, including lots of stuff that would never end up in an archive because it was sort of flotsam and jetsam, but that stuff was amazing. By the time I was done going through that, and it probably took me a year all told, because the stuff was in California, I was living in New York, I shipped some of it home.
So she actually, when she didn't just say, here's access to it, she basically gave it to you.
Well, you know, nobody was paying the rent at that point on the storage unit, so I think they were kind of feeling like, you know,
maybe
like, take it, or, I mean, and nobody really, he had a bunch of daughters and a bunch of ex-wives, and, you know, nobody was quite in control. So it was just, here, have it. And I mean, when I say a year, I'm maybe exaggerating, but it took me a long time to go through the material, and it was all, you know, it was a mess because it wasn't in any kind of order, so it took a long time to go through it. But of course it changed the book completely because suddenly I felt like
you had
I
a whole new
understood
character
this guy.
too. Yeah, I mean, he wasn't just a producer.
Yeah, I mean, he was actually so deep. his life paralleled Lee's in their devotion to the idea of Rin Tin Tin in a way that I had never imagined.
It was like Lee handed him the baton and said, you know, now you take it, take care of him, you know.
And he, at even greater cost than Lee, you know, at one point when he was already quite broke, Disney offered him $5 million for the character of Rin Tin Tin, for the rights to the character, all the television show, everything that had already been produced. And he said, no, it's my character. I am Rin Tin Tin's, you know, manager, and it's my project, and I want to stick with it. And this is a man who died destitute.
Yeah.
You know, there was a point when he suddenly thought, all right, I can sell a half share. He simply didn't want to give away what he felt was so important to him, and he ended up in ruin, really.
Well, there is, you know, it's a poignant book, and there's kind of a dark side, really. I mean, because these two guys, you know, in one way, Rin Tin Tin's like their sort of rosebud or something like that, but in other ways, it's sort of their, I don't know what the right metaphor is, but it kind of haunts them, you know?
Yeah.
And it becomes their guiding light, but not in a good way. And they take these outrageous gambles for them, and it's sort of, you know, and this all in the name of an abstraction, because the dog is who knows,
Right.
you know.
Right. And that's the funny thing when you say to people, well, it's a dog, it's a book about a dog who was in TV and movies, and, you know, the fact is, in many ways, it's a very dark story, and a lot of the people in it have lives that go off the rails.
Yeah, everyone who touches Rin Tin Tin
degree.
seems like it goes off the rails. I hope you're...
Yeah, so far I'm okay.
You're okay, yeah. No, you say that's nice. You say, basically you realize everyone is just crazy in this book. You say, at some point, the story took a turn. I was in Texas and in Los Angeles on and off for several years, and I began to feel like everyone I met or heard about in connection to Rin Tin Tin was a little crazy. Even the side players and background people, and definitely the main characters in the narrative, every one of them had a facet that glinted with just a bit of madness. And you really see this, and I wasn't prepared for that. I mean, the last third or quarter of the book is sort of, in a weird way, it's more like something like The Orchid Thief, where you sort of have these bizarre sort of characters fighting with each other in lawsuits and things like that. It was an interesting reprise.
It was peculiar because it also, it occurred to me that was also the story of Hollywood, that Hollywood in the 1920s was the kind of place where you could literally walk up and down the street, you could say, I have a screenplay here, would you like to buy it? And now, you know, starting in, I would say probably the 80s or so, the corporatization of Hollywood, the massiveness of it, the complexity of it, the amount of money involved, everything just went haywire, and everybody's lawyer has a lawyer, and everything is litigation, and it was just a completely different place.
Right.
And it was funny to imagine that Lee Duncan never had a lawyer, never had a manager, never had an agent.
Everything was a handshake with him, no contracts.
And so in that sense, it really was a sort of provided a perfect metaphor for Hollywood and how Hollywood has become this extraordinarily complicated and fairly crazy place.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that was so poignant, and I'll end with this and we'll open up for questions, was that, you know, in the end, the book is, as I think you say at some point, is sort of a meditation on permanence. You say, to me, the narrative of Rin Tin Tin is extraordinary because it has lasted. He is that rare thing that endures when so much else rushes past. And, you know, you talk about how even you sort of indulge in this. You say, I started my own story by thinking that Lee and Bert and Daphne were curious specimens for their stubborn devotion, and then realized that I was no different, elbowing my way into the chorus of narrators to advance the tale that much further, to become part of what was always means. I too had set out to be remembered. I'd wanted to create something permanent in my life, some proof that everything in its way mattered. And, you know, that's the task of writing. And And it's, to me, it's sort of antithetical to the task of Hollywood in a way, which is about not remembering doing 5 different versions of something. And that's sort of, you follow the logic of the Rin Tin Tin, and it just kind of, in these people, exploded, as you say. You have this sort of this megalith that you have now. Did it, at the end of this book, did you feel that it made you skeptical that there was a possibility of making meaning in the kind of authentic, maybe somewhat sort of corny way that Rin Tin Tin had made meaning both for people's lives and certainly these men's lives?
Well, I think, for one thing, it was sort of an acknowledgement at the end of the book that this persistent desire that Lee had, that Bert had, that Daphne had, that everyone should remember Rin Tin Tin forever, the legacy should continue forever. Well, you can look at it and think that just look at their lives are so sort of bent and awkward because of this single-mindedness and this need to have this character remembered forever. Of course, it's hard to not step back and think, well, that is, as you say, what writing is about. And of course, we write to make the thing we're writing about last forever. Right. And because it was a hard book to do, it took me a lot of time. There were moments where I thought, why am I doing this? I mean, what is it about?
I'll buy another cow.
Right, I can just be a farmer. But realizing that you can't write a book without a tremendous amount of devotion, and you can't do it without letting some of your life fall away. It's not, I've been lived with as a writer, and I live with someone who is writing a book, and it's not a very civilized time of your life. And it made me realize that this is, again, a sort of moment of the hunter being captured by the prey, of thinking, this is about that pursuit of permanence that every writer absolutely is part of. And to tell a story that other people will hear and embrace as if it's their own. And while Hollywood, we may look at making a TV show as a more shallow version of that, but the motivation was the same, which is, I love this character, I want people to share in this story, and I'm going to do what it takes to make that happen. It felt like a sort of dawning on me that this was an inescapable parallel, and particularly in my case, to tell the story of Rin Tin Tin. Right. So that at a moment when his profile is low, here's this story telling it again, which is exactly what Lee and Bert and Daphne had been doing. Remembering anything and caring about anything, whether it's trivial or profound, is a profound act. The idea of people around the world liking the same pop song. I mean, that's a profound moment in what it means to be living among people. So is the idea of making Rin Tin Tin last, on one hand, it's a story. It's a story that for a good part of this stretch of time was mostly for kids, and it involves a kind of dramatic, heroic figure that we now look at as a bit naive. But the idea of anything lasting and anything that can bring people from all different sorts of worlds together, to me, is profound and fascinating, whatever it is, however slight or grand it is. And I find those things absolutely fascinating and emotional. Yeah, we've captured it beautifully. So we have a microphone, so if people want to ask questions. Yeah. Yes?
Thank you. If I may, I'd like to ask 2 questions. The first one is you were prepared to start writing, and then you came across this incredible stash, which you had to go through, and then that changed the whole course and theme of the book. What did this do to your deadline and your relationship with your editor? That's question one. And question two is, how do you feel about other people's How I Got That story? I love them. I wish there were more of them. And I wondered if you like reading other people's How I Got That story.
I'll start with that question just because it's fresh in my mind. You know, I think there's a very fine line between moments where I just think, oh my God, I couldn't care less about how you got the story, and then times when it's part of what makes the story interesting. I think it's the classic sort of pornography rule. I mean, there are times when I just find it absolutely intrusive and obnoxious, and some of it, I will even be more basic. Sometimes I just don't like the writer that much, and I really don't care that much about them, and their trials and tribulations are of no interest to me, even if they're kind of interesting, because I don't like them that much. I want to hear the story. I think if the writer, you know, you put yourself out there, and you know, I've had a few critics who scolded. Actually, I had got a hilarious email from someone the other day just saying, you know, I love your book, but it's obvious to me that you blog and tweet a lot, because I can't believe how many times you said things like, and then I had lunch. And I thought, you know what, I don't think I ever in the book said, and then I had lunch. But I can't even give you an absolute answer, because with the writers who I love, I'm dying to hear how they got this story, because it's part of the story. You know, if Joan Didion describes to me how she came upon information or how she felt about it, it's fascinating. And with other people, not so much. There's Joan and then everybody else. As far as what it did to my deadline, I ended up with 3 extensions. And I had a falling out with my first publisher because it was taking me a long time. And, you know, I often thought, oh, I don't know that this is like a time-pegged book that has to be out now as opposed to 6 months from now. But also, it wasn't ready. So I just had to deal with that. And it's not, I mean, I don't like to encourage people who've never written a book to, what I tend to encourage people to do is, you think a book is going to take you X amount of time, double that time and make that your deadline, because books are really hard, and they're exponentially harder than a magazine story. So you can't equate it to thinking, well, this is like writing 10 magazine pieces. It's not. It's much more, it requires much more thought about structure and, you know, tone and narrative. So it's much, much harder. And in this case, I also add 2 years to having a baby, without a doubt. You know, so it took me a long time, but some of it was just personal, you know, distraction, or like distraction.
Yeah. Right. Other questions?
Hi, you mentioned Didion, but can you list some of your other favorite writers or who you like to hear stories from?
My favorite nonfiction writers? John McPhee. I mean, they're all going to be pretty unsurprising, but John McPhee, Joan Didion, Joseph Mitchell, A.J. Liebling, Ian Fraser. I know I'm forgetting some people. Well, that's what I start with. I mean, the books that I have sitting on my desk as I write are Great Plains by Ian Fraser, whatever Joan Didion book I happen to want sitting there, and a couple John McPhee books. And I use them just when I'm really stuck, and I'll flip through and look for inspiration and see how they've solved problems that that I've run across, and also just to remind myself that if somebody did get this right, so
it's possible.
There's a chance.
Other questions? Yeah. Wait. No, you gotta wait for the mic.
You mentioned that when you first describe an idea to people, that they often say, "I don't know what you're talking about. That sounds weird," etc. Particularly early on in your career, how did you persuade editors, therefore, to say yes?
That's a good question, because it's difficult. I think what happened was I started somewhere, as I mentioned, where they gave me a lot of freedom, and so I was able to show that I could do those stories, because the fact is it's all in the execution. And I remember when Tina Brown first took over The New Yorker, and we had this kind of come to Jesus moment, because the kinds of stories I do are exactly the kinds of stories that she hates and wanted to purge out of The New Yorker. And I'm proud to say that she used one of my stories as an example of the kind of story that would not be in The New Yorker once she took over. I'm kind of proud of that in a weird way, because I'm proud of it for this very reason, that she was so opposed to those stories that where there was no elevator pitch, that you couldn't say, well, it's a profile of Tom Cruise, you know, that I knew that I had to make it work. The thing is that I really, for better or worse, I actually really believe they're interesting. So I have the kind of lucky obliviousness to it being not an obvious story. I mean, and I think that that helps me, because I just think, oh my God, it's such a great story. It's so obvious. So I think what happens is you get one or two chances to do it, and if you can pull it off, you're going to give an editor a little bit more comfort about letting you try those pieces that aren't so obvious. Now, I will say, I don't sit down and think, let me think of a purposefully obscure idea. And I think that an editor is wise to avoid that. But I think it comes naturally to me. It really is what I think about. So my enthusiasm is authentic. Now, that doesn't mean, oh, editors will know, oh, wow, you really mean it, so I'm going to let you write a story about taxidermy. But I do think they also have they can respond to what's genuine interest in your part versus, let me think of a really weird story. Because I don't think they're weird. I think they're all like, wow, it's so obvious. But I think you need to just have a chance to publish a couple, which sounds funny, but I think you need to say, and this is how it'll turn out. I also try to figure out why I'm interested in those stories, because I'm not somebody who sort of floats off in the ether. I'm a real populist. I'm fascinated by things that relate to the greatest number of people. So my idea is, here's an obscure thing, but I see completely how it connects to a more central, more familiar idea. And I think that's important. Now, one way I would recommend, as long as we're on the subject, this is probably somewhat useful. One thing that I've always found helpful is if you can think of one of those stories that you're excited about that comes at a a bigger, more obvious story just in a new, somewhat oblique way. And I'll give you 2 examples, because then I think an editor is going to be more comfortable. In one instance, it was after the Oklahoma City bombing, and every news report mentioned that Timothy McVeigh lived in a trailer park. And one day I was thinking, what does that even mean? I mean, I read it and I think I know what it means, but I don't have the slightest idea of what life is like in a trailer park. So I went to the New Yorker and I said, I want to write a story about life in a trailer park to answer that question. So it wasn't just like, I woke up today thinking about trailer parks, but that it was answering a real question about something that was very present. And I think that that can also help with getting an editor to feel a little more comfortable with that kind of story.
Other questions? Anyone over there? Yep. Allison, wait, you give her the mic. No, you got to wait for the mic.
Okay, thanks. I have 2 questions, actually. The one is the obvious question, so I'll go with that one first. Who's taking care of the chickens while you're in California this year?
You know what, it's funny, and I did say this in a sulky way when I was first moving to California. I would say to everybody, and in fact I mentioned on Twitter, you know, we're going to California for the year. Nobody said to me, wow, how do you feel about it? It was like, oh my God, who's taking care of the chickens? And I thought, well, thanks, everyone. We have house sitters, the people who are already helping us with our cattle, who are living in our house, and they're taking care of the chickens, the cattle, one of our cats, and the turkeys. And actually, in our absence, added 2 geese to our menagerie. So we're getting ready for the arc.
Yeah, it seems that way. 2 of everything, yes.
No segue, but question number 2 is, so like how does that kind of idea develop? So you're thinking about the trailer parks, let's say, in relation to Timothy McVeigh. At what point does that kind of get hashed out in a meeting with an editor? You know, how advanced is the story? Have you found the trailer park yet, or you talk about it together?
That's a good example of something that, so I start with this question, which is what does that mean to say someone lives in a trailer park? And then I thought, I want to write about a trailer park. Then the problem is, well, once you start looking at, there are lots of different kinds of trailer parks. So how do you pick one? And I didn't want to do a story where it was, you know, forgive me, but the classic New York Times story of, we talked to people in 20 different trailer parks and we have quotes from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I didn't want to do that. I actually at one point thought I literally could throw a dart at a map and just say, here's a location, I'm going to find a trailer park, because there is no typical trailer park. You know, they have a certain, there are certain commonalities there, but to pick one by definition is specific and individual. And I just didn't know what to do, and I thought just literally throwing a dart, because we talked about that, and I said, I just want to go and spend 4 or 5 days in a trailer park and just try to write a slice of life piece. And then I realized that I knew of one trailer park when I had lived in Portland, Oregon, that just because when I'd done some stories with cops, we would drive around there, and at that time it was right near a racetrack, so there were a lot of transients and a lot of drug dealers, a lot of hookers, and I knew it had kind of cleaned up a little bit. But I knew of it, I knew the setting a little bit, so I thought, well, why not just do that since I know it? You know, rather than just pulling something out of a hat. But I feel like I could have picked just about anything, although that had the advantage of probably having some parallels with the place. It was out west, had a lot of transient residence, which is not unlike the one that Timothy McVeigh lived in. Lots of times I come up with an idea, and then I have to find the individual to represent the idea, and then, of course, what seemed like this big topic suddenly is this individual, and it gets complicated. But then the individual, once I settle on it, I always feel like, wow, this was such like the perfect one to pick, because anyone would have been the perfect one to pick. I'm lucky because I also go into those stories saying I'm not exactly sure what I'm doing, and I need to go and be there. I can't tell you the story. If I could tell it to you, then it's not interesting, because then I'm not going to be learning anything. I just know that I want to somehow tell the story of what it means to say life in a trailer park. So it's not just some shorthand that we all think we know. I hope that answered your question.
Hi. So I'm starting to write a book now, and each chapter is going to be a kind of its own standalone reported nonfiction piece, long magazine length. And I'm sitting down to write my first lead for the first chapter for what will be the book proposal. And I'm realizing I've never done this before. You know, I've always had an editor, and I haven't been able to say, oh, what's my voice? Like, I don't know yet. I haven't started it. So as I'm doing it, I'm realizing I'm having a new problem, which is anecdotal lead versus what I think you are amazing at is a non-anecdotal lead, a lead that's a thought that's kind of teased out, and you'll do a lot of humor with a kind of often with an unexpected paradox, you know, right in the first couple of sentences, where you just say, huh, and then it does the job of a lead, drawing you in. So I guess I was curious about that, how you think about that. I'm trying to think of your pieces if you've done an anecdotal lead. It's kind of a narrative, you know, nonfiction trope, but if you use them, what do you think of them? I'll just put out the context.
Sure.
The stuff that I'm writing about, a lot of it is really exciting. I mean, it's like motorcycles flying through the air and, you know, crazy looking things. So the idea is funny. You're making a motorcycle fly through the air without a ramp, but I still am kind of drawn to your humorous lead. So I don't know. What do you think?
Leads are both incredibly hard to explain and so important that you feel like you want to explain them, and you also want to know where they came from. And when I think about the lead for Rin Tin Tin, I mean, I can't even begin to tell you how long I spent on that. And it sounds like your book is different, and although I assume you'll have an opening and sort of introductory chapter. But I also have the terrible problem, which is I find it hard to write anything out of order. I really feel that I have to start in the beginning and then go to the next part and then go to the next part, which means a lot of time sitting there. And I know in my mind that I've got all this stuff that I'm going to do, but I can't get to it till I get the lead done. And some of the leads that I've written, I look at and think, you know what, I have no clue. I can't even begin to tell you, and you know, sometimes I'll write them, it'll just be some strange sort of riff in my head, and I always then have to show it to another more sane person and say, does this make any sense? I mean, does imagining that I have married a 10-year-old boy make sense? Where does it come from? It's just one of those, it's almost like telling a joke or I think it's a lot of time sitting there and not writing. And I think that's painful but important, of just letting it sort of circulate around in your head. And then I think it's probably like writing a song where you then suddenly there it is and it seems very natural and you don't know where it came from. I think being really loose, not feeling that you I mean, I think a lot of people feel that they have to compress their entire story or book into the first sentence. And I don't think you have to. I think you have to be incredibly alluring and kind of sexy and enchanting, but I don't think you have to tell the whole story. I don't even think you need to tell important information. I just think you have to have people go, oh, this sounds so interesting. And I think if you picture yourself walking into a room and people are chatting and you want to tell the story about your motorcycles, but you want to get everybody to just be quiet quickly and listen to you for a second, you're not going to come in and say, my story is about. Right. You're just going to have a line, a way to stop people and have them turn and listen to you. So I think it's really liberating to appreciate that you don't have to write a super miniaturized version of your book in the first sentence or even the second or even the first paragraph. If it's enchanting, if it's enticing, people will read it and you should never be confusing, but you can definitely be, and I say sexy because I mean you can kind of tease people and make them think, what are you talking about? You don't want to make them think, what the hell are you talking about? It's more of like, oh, this is interesting. And then you can say, well, as long as I've got you here all relaxed, I'm going to tell you what this is about. So throwing away that feeling of needing to deliver information will help. And then otherwise, I'd say just play around, goof around, write whatever comes to mind. Look and see if it keeps you interested. If not, throw it out. Just keep playing and try coming at it absolutely from another direction than you expected. And just force yourself to be playful and see if it gets you to something that's just going to be a come hither and get people to go, huh, I want to hear more. I hope that helps. It's 90% mystery, though, honestly.
I think we have time for one more.
You're a very active blogger and Twitterer. And the image of you kind of sitting there struggling with the lead doesn't quite jive with then going over and doing, all these other short form things that you do. So I'm wondering, it could work in either direction. It could either sort of sap your energy from the serious work of writing long, or it could sort of feed you and it could be part of this playing that you want to do. So what's your experience been?
I think writing, I've thought about this a lot, and I think writing is muscular, and that the more you use it, the better it is, and the more limber you are, and also the less apprehension you have about it. I don't think it's an oxygen tank that is slowly dwindling and then you die. So I happen to think that writing lots of short things, because I think leads are so important, I think that writing a lot of short things, which forces you to write lots of little leads in a way, is good. It's good practice. It's good practice if for no other reason than it makes you feel more relaxed. Now, writing the lead for a book, and a book that spans almost 100 years of time, it was a huge challenge to somehow convey a whole bunch of feelings in that first couple of paragraphs. But I happen to think that the more you write, the better it is for you, and that I don't see it as a precious, as something very precious that you can't, if you use it too much, it will be depleted. The more relaxed you are, it's gotta help. It just has to. And it's also true that if you're sitting there and you cannot think of a lead, and the day has gone by and you have no words on the page, but you've been tweeting, you think, all right, at least I still know English, all right? Got that nailed down. Then, I can move from there. I mean, of course it can be an attractive nuisance and you have to be careful, but I think you should just feel that writing is like talking, and the ease with which you might tell an interesting story should translate to the page. And I think the more you talk and the more, you know, the more you try to tell a story to a group of people, the better you get at it. If you do it once in a long time, you're not going to have that, you won't even know that metabolism of an audience. The way I think the more you write, the more you begin feeling like, here I'm going to make it funny, and here I'm going to quiet it down, and I bet people will respond to this. And the more you write, and Twitter and blogging, but Twitter even more, you get an immediate reaction of, this worked, this made sense. I mean, sometimes it can be just, you know, had lunch, and people go, yeah, me too. And so it's not always an endorsement of your genius, but you know, I think there are times when you write something and it clicks and people respond and you think, oh, all right, I know how to do that. So I think that's all good. Writing is performance, and I think that the more you do it, the more ease and command you have of it.
All right, well, thank you so much. Susan's books are for sale. Please buy them.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.